My name is George Spence. I was born at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in May of 1964. My father was Ray Spence, Ray Lawrence Spence. He kind of went by both names depending on whether it was family or professional. He was a Army officer. He spent a career at that. My mother was Alfreda Spence. And she was a homemaker, but also was an office worker, kind of like an administrative assistant is what she ended up being. And so
tell me, where did you graduate high school, and then after that, how'd you end up in Benton County?
I went to high school at Fort Smith, Southside, and graduated in '82, and went from there to the University of Arkansas, where I got an accounting degree. And after my accounting degree, I went on to law school, also at the University of Arkansas. After graduating there, I took a job with Price Waterhouse, which is it's now called Price Waterhouse Coopers, but it's a very prominent international accounting firm, and felt incredibly fortunate, almost surprised to get the offer to go to work there. But because of my law degree, it interested them to have somebody like that on the tax staff. Anyway, went to Kansas City and spent three years there, what I call my wilderness years. And after about 3 years, 2.5 years, it became obvious to them that I wasn't probably going to be somebody who was going to be with the firm for a long time. And I'd long thought I needed to get back to Arkansas, get back home. And I ended up losing my job, and I moved back home, was living in my parents' basement, and I sent out resumes all over the state, and a lot of them were to prosecutors' offices. And I got a call from Terry Womack, who was David Klinger's office manager. He was the prosecutor here, and I came up and interviewed, and they hired me about a week later, and here I came.
So tell us, what was it like working under Klinger as a prosecutor?
It was just about the best learning opportunity. Working under Klinger was about the best learning opportunity that I think a lawyer could get. At that time particularly, I got the opportunity to work for David Klinger and get training by him. And I also received training more or less from Tom Keith, who was the circuit judge at the time. And through Klinger and the deputies that worked under him where I trained, it just gave me an opportunity to hone my skills as a trial lawyer. Not that some people want to just say they're big trial lawyers. Most of them aren't. Most people who claim to be trial attorneys, that just means they've had a trial at some point. But I wanted to be able to do that kind of work, and so I got the training. And then the aspect, Judge Keith held a high standard from the perspective of he wanted to. He came from a defense background, so he was kind of oriented that way. So he was actually going to make you prove your case. And so that combination, and I think the training that I had there has stood me well going into other courts. There were some instances when I went before Judge Story down in Washington County, and Judge Story kind of had a reputation of being difficult to be in front of. And like most judges, really all they want is for you to come in and do your job. And because I'd had the training here, I was able to do that job, and so I didn't have any problems in front of Judge Story.
Some of the people we've talked to said that Klinger was very good for being prepared for cases. Can you speak to that?
Talk about Klinger's preparation. Klinger was obsessive about preparation. And this is really kind of the training I was talking about. He wanted no surprises, and when we were going up to try a case, which was basically trying a case for him, he wanted us the same way. He wanted us to have asked all the questions. One of the cases I worked on when I was in the prosecuting attorney's office, the mayor of Bentonville, Don O'Neill, got accused of theft, more or less, from the city relating to having a water line. The allegation was that it was extended to his property. He made the change and it benefited him, all that sort of stuff. And myself, along with Tom Fortune and Kenny Farmer, who were deputy sheriffs. Tom worked for Benton County, and then Kenny was actually working at what was called the Bella Vista branch of the Benton County Sheriff's Office at that time. We did formal interviews, more than 250 interviews in that case. And that was all because when we got to trial, we didn't want to have any surprises. And and it was a big case. I mean, if you're prosecuting the mayor of Bentonville on something that at least tangibly relates to his duties, then that's a big political case. And so we were trying to nail it down as well as we could.
250.
Yeah, well, and I also worked several homicide cases, and I mean, it was just relentless. Really
Can you talk about any of the homicide cases that he prosecuted? Were you in the trials?
I wasn't in any of the trials. Now, there were the first homicide case I went out and worked on. It was October of 1992. The deputies, the way this worked was, a deputy was always on call on the weekend, and when you're a young man, I was 25, I guess, when I went to work there. No, I take that back. I was 28. When you're a young man like that, doing this kind of work, there's a lot of excitement. So whoever was on call, oftentimes the other deputies would say, if you get a call out, if there's a homicide, let me know. And somebody else was on call. I think it was Brad Butler, and Everett Frazier had killed his wife, Winona. And so that was the first one I worked. I remember it particularly because we were back writing the search warrants. And I'm writing the search warrant, and I'm describing, you have to describe the scene in detail, and I'm writing the search warrant. I'm describing there's a body out on the porch of this house. The house no longer exists. It's down kind of toward Crystal Bridges, and it's all that property is gone now. It's on 5th Street. And I'm describing it, and this is October, I think it was October 22nd. I'm describing there's a body on the front porch. Well, at that time, it's right before Halloween. There were decorations like that all over the place. This was the only one that was real. So, but the Everett Frazier case, that was later. That actually was tried by Brad Butler, who was the subsequent prosecutor. Klinger decided to let him try it. I think that trial actually came after Klinger was elected judge. And then the next homicide case I got called out and got called over to Sulphur Springs. Can't remember the deceased name, I should say decedent. I'm used to being a private lawyer now doing probate work. But the two defendants were a guy named Paul Stacy and a young man named Thomas Aman. And they had, the allegation was, which they later pled guilty to, is that they had met a guy at a bar up in southeast Missouri, and he was drunk, and they saw he had some money on him, and they rode with him, got out in the country, and took a tire iron and killed him. And so, had that kind of, and then right after that was the Dustin Denton case, where he had killed a young man named Joe Dozier. And that ended up being a trial. It was really kind of a battle of the titans, because it was Klinger and John Everett was the defense attorney. And I kind of worked that case at the same time I was working the one about the mayor that I told you about earlier. And we got to the trials were set about 3 or 4 weeks apart. And so I ended up passing off the murder case to one of the other deputies, Drew Miller, and he sat in with Klinger. Klinger actually tried that case. He also tried the mayor's case. And just a kind of a horrible tragedy. Dustin Denton was acquitted. The jury decided it was more or less self-defense. And then I also worked another homicide case out of Sulphur Springs. Gary Ramsey had shot his wife. He was drunk, and it was kind of an abusive situation. It was I remember the audio of the phone call when he called in, because you could tell he was drunk, and he said I think I've killed my wife. And they said, what? And he said, what happened? And he said, I blew her fucking head off. And that's what he had done. He'd been it was an abusive relationship, and he was drunk, and he was firing his gun, and he was kind of, I don't know if he's trying to scare or intimidate or what, but he was trying to shoot by her, and basically he missed, and he hit her in the cranium, and it blew off the top of her head. It was pretty horrific. One of the things about being a prosecutor, at least for me, going and looking at kind of gross scenes is, I think for the average person, they go, oh, I never want to do that. When you're doing it as part of your job, it's kind of clinical. And you go out there, oh, that's interesting how that's turned or whatever. So, a little different. So
when you finished, what happened after you worked for the prosecutor's office?
After the prosecutor's office, I worked for Klinger, and then Brad Butler was elected, and I worked, just a few months for him, and I decided I probably wasn't going to be able to continue there. So I went out and started working on something different, and I went to work for Kevin Pollock, who was the city attorney here at the time. And when I say I went to work for him, I worked out of his office. We kind of had an arrangement. I did some of the city work. I did the prosecution for him, more or less. At the time, Kevin, and then the Rogers city attorney at the time was Dan Ford, and the way they worked their offices was they always had one deputy who was somebody, it's almost always somebody who used to work for Klinger, who came in and they did the city prosecutions so that they wouldn't have to deal with those. So I worked for Klinger not for Klinger, but worked out of Kevin's office for about a year, and decided that wasn't going to be in my long-term interest financially. So I went out on my own. Worked out of my house for, 6-8 months, until I officed with John Skaggs for about probably a year. I just rented space from him. John Skaggs was the municipal judge at the time, but he had a private practice, and I just rented space from him. And then my law partner, Greg Clark, he had decided to run for circuit judge. He was running for juvenile judge, and I was out. I'd gotten interested in politics, or I guess you'd call it politics, helping people run for office. When Klinger ran for judge, Brad Butler, who was Klinger's successor, ran for prosecutor, and Brad and I were friends working together in the prosecutor's office. And Brad and I actually didn't really know each other in school, but we graduated from high school together. And he and I were personal friends, and I really put a lot of effort into helping Brad get elected prosecutor. And then a couple years later, Tom Fortune ran for county judge, and I helped him run. And so I'd gotten interested in that sort of thing, and when I found out Greg was running, I had a lot of respect for Greg from dealing with him and his dad, Jim Clark. They had both worked for Klinger. And so I helped Greg run, and along about 2 or 3 weeks before the election, Greg said, after this election is over, why don't you come over and partner up with me? His dad had left to go work for the city of Rogers. And I said, well, why don't we just worry about getting you elected? And he said, well, let's face it, that's not going to happen. So right after the election, I came over, and I've been here with Greg for 24 years.
So how did you first get involved in serving government as client? You said you'd worked for another lawyer, but when did you start doing more?
I was, when I came to the prosecutor's office, I wanted to be as broad as possible. And I told Judge Klinger that coming in. And so when I came into the prosecutor's office, in addition to having my duties as a prosecutor, I was the one generally assigned to do the civil matters for the county. A woman named Jennifer Wheeler at the time, I think it's now Haskins, but Jennifer worked it with me for while she was there. She did the juvenile court work and did some of that. But I was the one who, when there were civil cases for the county, I was the one who handled them. And I attended quorum court meetings and got into doing that sort of thing. Handled a couple of fairly significant appellate cases. Actually, one even started out in trial involving tax assessment and collection. So I represented the assessor and collector on that stuff.
So what was the quorum court like when you first started? What year was it, and what were they like?
I started in July of '92. Just my 30-year anniversary as actually practicing law has just passed. And I was immediately kind of assigned to that duty. I was interested in it, and it was viewed, I wouldn't say it was viewed as a hassle, but it was just viewed as something that had to be taken care of by the prosecutor. Prosecutors generally aren't interested in doing that because you're likely to get into political problems, and it's just a whole different ballgame. You don't have the kind of control you do when you're the prosecutor and you're doing a criminal matter. I kind of liked it. So the quorum court at the time, the county judge at the time was Bruce Rutherford. And the quorum court, and I want to say it was 13 members at the time, but it seems like it was less. I'm not sure. But there were a couple of people who were, we still had a couple Democrats at the time, I think. One of them was J.C. Beaver from out in Pea Ridge. And we had some, it was just really good folks sitting doing the county's business. You did have a little bit of the Republican, Democrat, but it wasn't the kind of things you see in politics today. It was more the old time, just little internal contest. It wasn't some of the stuff I see today is just crazy. Um, there were two people on the quorum court at the time. A guy named Earl Fimmer's one of them, and then there was Dick Michael. And Earl and Dick were much more likely to be skeptical of things. Not that all of them didn't do their job, but they were almost, sometimes at the time particularly, I thought, you're almost being obstructive. There was also a woman on the quorum court named Tamra. I want to say it was Tamra Sawyer. I think she still went by the name Sawyer. She had been married to a prominent local attorney and had divorced, and she was still around. But Tamra, she could be, and she was a little bit more expressive about it. And she was just really country. The other two, Dick and Earl, were two guys that had made their living somewhere else and had retired and come here, and they were doing this. Tamara was from here, so she was more of the people. And then you had Ann Minor, who Ann was involved in a lot of the. She was very active and very good, very smart. She was from out at the Beaver Lake area, copper mine. She and her husband owned a lodge out there, which later had some problems because of a gas infiltration problem. But just a fine lady. Otis Cathy was the finance guy for the chair of the finance committee, and Otis also was a guy who'd retired here from someplace else. He and his wife were just fabulous. Dot was her name, and I used to see them at Republican functions. And then Tim Henderson, who's still around. He's out on the west side. He ran for county judge, about 2006 or so. And then J.C. Beaver, Dodie Evans was on the quorum court at the time. He was a newspaperman, and Dodie was kind of the conscience of the court. He kind of knew the history, and he could sit and talk about things, and he would really kind of sometimes challenge the court members to look a little deeper. Dennis Wolford, who I became close friends with later, was on the quorum court. He was probably in his early 30s then. He was a builder and a guy did a lot of real estate, and he was somebody else who was. These folks were all just really competent and very interested in doing the county's business and seeing that things were done right. And then, I've told you about the quorum court, and then you had a whole cast of characters in the county offices at the time. Bruce was the county judge. Shirley Sandlin was the county assessor. She'd already been the county assessor for quite a while and remained in the county assessor's role for 8 or 10 years after that, and then ran for the quorum court, was on the quorum court for probably 10 years. And it was Shirley. The county collector at the time was Teresa Pockrass. Teresa I got to know a little later because after she got beat, she went to law school, so I got to deal with her some as a lawyer. And Teresa had a little bit different personality, but she ended up being great to talk to. There was a perception of them as being somehow resistant to what the county judge, Bruce Rutherford, was doing, and that they were somehow trying to control the county. And then you had Mary Lou Slinkard, who was the county clerk, and Gloria Peterson was was the county treasurer at the time, and Gloria, 30 years later, is still in office. She's now the county collector and has been for 10 years or so. She retired and stayed out a while, came back and worked at the prosecutor's office for a year or two, and then decided to run for county collector. And she's been the collector for many years. And Gloria, she's great. Sue Hodges was the circuit clerk at the time. Although Brenda, the current circuit clerk, was around back then as a deputy. At that time, we didn't have an elected coroner. That came later. Bruce Rutherford, the county judge, was a very large personality. He was also an enormous man. He was just shaking hands with him. It was one of those deals where you'd feel like your hand was just going to be crushed. And Klinger Bruce was a deputy sheriff, and before that I think he may have been a silent patrolman. And Klinger used to tell a story about somebody who tried to attack Bruce one time, and he ended up grabbing two guys and holding one under each arm and had both of them off the ground where they couldn't their feet were kicking, and so Bruce was something else. Anyway, it was a big cast of characters.
Well, what were some of the issues that you have had to advise them on over the years?
More or less, as far as advising them, what I was doing was just trying to get them through the meetings and handle things appropriately. As I said, I was involved with representing the county on some civil matters, some tax cases that ended up being fairly significant. We had the same issues then that we have now. When I travel around the country, I like reading the local newspapers. At least I used to when there were newspapers. And you pick up a newspaper virtually anywhere, a local newspaper, and they all say the same thing. It's just the names are different. Everybody has got some public official who's put their hand in the till. Everybody has problems about jail capacity. Most are looking at needing to expand facilities. And we were doing all those things then. When we, I think it was 94, we ran a proposal to build a new justice center out where the county jail is now on Highway 102, which failed. And so we immediately were turning around trying to figure out what to do because we needed some room, and that ended up where we built the administration building. My recollection is we paid $2.9 million for the administration building when it was built. I'm sure it would cost 5 times that to build today. And just the real estate in downtown Bentonville would probably cost that today. So it was more of those kind of things. There was not, there weren't any particular issues that I remember. It was just the normal business of running a county.
Didn't you talk about work you've done for cities also?
When I left the prosecutor's office, I went to work for Kevin Pollack, who was the city attorney for the city of Bentonville at the time. And I did some representation of the city then, not a whole lot. But in 2000 or thereabouts, there was a controversy involving Kevin's office and the hot check fund, and Kevin ended up resigning. And I really wanted to be the city attorney. I really wanted to get in because it was the way Kevin had it set up. It was a good financial deal. And when I say he had it set up, the council set it up at his behest that way. And when the city just held off doing anything for a while, but it's an elected position, so at some point they had to do something. And so they finally took applications, and I went in and applied, and it was me and John Dodge, who had worked for Klinger back but long before I was there as a deputy, and I think had run for prosecutor as well. And the third fellow that applied was Blaine Jackson, who was a local lawyer, had been here a long time. He got appointed for one of the judges resigned, one of the circuit judges, or maybe it was one of the chancellors at the time. And he ended up getting appointed for the remainder of one of the circuit judge terms. So both senior to me, but the advantage I had was the members of the city council. I'd interviewed them all, and when we were prosecuting the mayor of Bentonville, I'd gotten to know all of them. I got to know all the city staff. I got to know, at the time it was Terry Coberly, who was the mayor. I knew them all from the prosecution. So I came in, and they ended up appointing me city attorney on a close vote. It was 3 to 3, 4 to, anyway, Mayor Coberly had to vote to break the tie to get me appointed. And that was in about July of 2000. And then I had to run, because you're only appointed till the next general election. I had to run immediately. And I've been elected no opposition since then, 4 times, I think. And they changed the role quite a bit when they had the problem with Kevin. There'd always been complaints about, and when I say complaints, this is from the city council members, who felt like there wasn't enough control over the city attorney, because it was an elected office, so he was independent and could make his own decisions. So they wanted the mayor to have more control, so they ended up splitting the office into more or less a formal ceremonial portion, which is what I was appointed to, and then the working portion became an employee of the mayor. That's Camille Thompson, and has been ever since then. And so Camille and I have worked together over the years, and she and I are real good friends, and we've worked together on things. And she has actually brought me beyond the formal role into a lot more of a consultant role, and I've handled a number of cases for the city over time. Probably one of the more prominent ones was so I'd left the county entirely, and before I went back to working for the county again in 2009, I represented the city before the Arkansas Supreme Court in oral arguments and briefing on a case involving the county road tax. And I represented the city of Bentonville. Judge Green appeared for the county. She was then the county's lawyer. I want to say Tom Kicklack appeared on behalf of the city of Siloam Springs. Seems like there was one other lawyer involved. But we had oral arguments in the case, which is where you appear in front of it's like you see on TV with the United States Supreme Court, but it's the Arkansas Supreme Court. You usually go to Little Rock for those arguments. Well, one of the justices created this thing called Justice on Wheels. They wanted to start going around to different places, and the first time they did that, I appeared at that because we were arguing the Worth tax case. I was appearing on behalf of the Bentonville School District, and David Matthews and he was there for Rogers Schools, appeared at the University of Arkansas, the E.J. Ball courtroom down there. They had the Arkansas Supreme Court held their session there that day, and David and I argued that case down there that day. I think that was the first time they'd ever done it out at Little Rock. And then this other thing for the city, they did out at the community college. And it was over this road tax. It was a bunch of money involved, and I was a little bit nervous. And not only because it was a big deal, but because since it was local, there were a whole bunch of local people that I knew out there. So, but it ended up going the city's way. So, yeah, and I since I've been back with the county, that comes up repeatedly, and I tell them, you probably should have had me as your lawyer back then.
So when you came back to the county the second time, what was it like then?
So when I came back to the county the second time, what was it like? I guess I should explain how I got there a little bit. In 2006, I ran for prosecuting attorney. It was a real big desire of mine after working for Klinger to do that job, and I thought I was the right man. And I ran, and a fellow named Van Stone ran, who was working in the prosecutor's office at the time. And as I tell everybody, I came in second in that race. It was a two-man race, and I came in second. So I did not get elected, and that was in 2006 in the primary in May. Well, I've been involved a little bit with Republican politics, and in that time frame, they were looking for a new chairman for the local Republican Party, for the Republican committee. And I knew some people because I'd just been around long enough. And I also, the man and I were opponents, but we were real respectful of each other. The day after he beat me in the election, I invited him and took him out to Rotary and introduced him as the next prosecutor. So a lot of people really admired that, and I got a lot of compliments on how we had conducted ourselves. And some of those were from the Republicans, the party people. So, and Henry Keith, Tom Keith's wife, was the secretary of the Republican committee, and she suggested I ought to be the chairman. So they made me the Republican Party chairman. And I served as the chairman, I guess, for 4 years. But, so all of this is going on, and then Judge Green, who's been the county attorney, gets elected judge. So she's leaving the county attorney role, and and at the same time, Gary Black is leaving as the county judge. And this is, I've told the subsequent county judges that I don't think that the county attorney and county judge should change out at the same time if it can be avoided, because I think it just causes some problems of nobody really knows what to do. Anyway, so the way I became county attorney at the time, Dave Bisbee became the county judge, and right before he took office, they didn't have a county attorney, so they were kind of flailing around with what to do, and he talked to Van Stone, who had been my opponent, who was the prosecuting attorney at the time, because unless there's somebody else selected, the prosecutor advises the quorum court, advises the county officials, and does all that work. For years, they'd had this other attorney in doing it, first Ed Garton and then Judge Green. So they didn't know what to do. And Van told Bisbee, let's go talk to George. And they came to the office one day and visited with me, and they wanted me to, I said, I don't want to be full-time. I had enough other stuff going on. At the time, I was still representing the school district, and I didn't want to give up those things for something that I felt was, could change at any time, how much they wanted you there. So I told them I'd wanted to do it. I'd do it, but I'd do it on a contract basis. And I said, this will be good for you, it'll be good for me, save the county money, and it'll be good for me because, I get some more work. And so that's what they did, and they told me, they said, well, we're just going to do this temporarily till we get somebody in. Well, very quickly, Judge Bisbee, Dave Bisbee, the county judge, decided he didn't want anybody else. So I've been doing the county work since 2009. I've been the only attorney really that does the county work. I mean, we farm out like the jail lawsuits and things like that, but yeah.
So talk about the big issues and more recent issues you've had to advise them on.
Well, the big issues more recently, it's some of it's the same issues that we talked about before. A couple years ago, we tried to get the voters to approve to build basically a new courthouse. Facilities is always an issue in any county, but particularly one that's growing like ours. That failed, and now we're talking to the voters about building a new jail and other facilities related to that. And it's the same kind of thing. I've talked a little bit about being involved with the school district here. Since I started working for the school district, was in, I want to say 96, we have probably built 10 or 12 elementary schools in the Bentonville School District. And Rogers is doing probably not quite as many, but certainly a bunch. And the other school districts are here too. If you're expanding that much there, you got to do the same thing with county facilities. You got to do the same thing with the county jail. There's just no other way. You have more bodies. So we continue to face those kinds of issues. Since I've been here, we've had a little bit of scandal here and there. We had the office manager in the county clerk's office. This is 10 years ago. Ended up having, there was allegations she was taking money. We had another. She was later convicted. We had another lady who worked in the county accounting office who was convicted of taking a whole bunch of money. We had, since I've been back, I guess when I got back, the sheriff was still Keith Ferguson. Well, we went from there to Kelly, whose last name escapes me at the moment. I don't really know why, but
Craddock.
Yeah, Kelly Craddock, and that was just a circus a lot of the time because Kelly just had much different ideas, and really, I'd say as much as anything, I don't think Kelly was paying as much attention to being sheriff as he should have. He had a lot of other things going on, and when you're elected, you don't really have any supervisor except the people, and that's every 2 years. Actually, now it's every 4 years. And you hire deputies and you basically allow them to do things, and over time it can just lead to you doing less and less. And Kelly eventually ended up resigning, and that was quite a traumatic thing. We had a couple of issues with regard to weather. In 2009, right after Judge Bisbee took office, we had an ice storm in Benton County, which anybody who lived around here in that time period will remember because it covered most of the state, most of the northwest part of the state. And we had a tremendous amount of damage to trees, roads, things like that. And we ended up hiring contractors to do it. And this is what I was saying about you need to have the county judge and the county attorney not leave at the same time, because Judge Bisbee had some very clear ideas about how he wanted to do things. And while I was an experienced attorney, I wasn't experienced with him. and might have done things a little different now, might have given him a little bit better guidance. And none of Dave's inclinations were wrong. What he was doing was trying to keep the work local, and he was real focused on that, and we probably should have just been focused a little differently on accomplishing the goal. And the goal was not to see that the work kept local. The goal was getting it handled in a manner that got the mission done and met the laws. And that ended up being a mess for quite a while, that cleanup. So, and then we had we've had several weather events. Roads are a constant issue if you're involved with the county. The county judge's main direction under the statutes is you're in charge of the roads. And in a lot of counties, that's a lot different than it is here, because you don't have as much central administration duties. In Benton County, there's a little more of that because, I'd say other counties, the guys oftentimes are more just road oriented. Here, they're a little bit more administration oriented, the county judges.
Anything else about working as county attorney that you can think of? Some interesting issues. Anything I hadn't thought to ask about? Or?
Well, personnel was always a big deal. When Judge Kleinert was in office, Bob Kleinert, we had the issue with the election commission, where had some election commissioners that were having some interaction problems with the employees, and we ended up changing the way that the election commission is set up. And that was a big, huge, I had to do a bunch of interviews and wrote a lengthy memo about kind of what had gone down and made some recommendations. But it used to be that the election commission was kind of a separate entity, and it still is, but all the employees of the election commission were actually under the election commissioners. We decided that we probably needed to have better supervision, so we moved everybody under the county clerk, and that's kind of changed things. And some of the election commissioners didn't like that. They liked having a little more control. But that was one of the big projects that was just the total focus for a while.
You mentioned that you had a leadership role in local Republican politics. Talk about just the general over time switch from blue to red, and how Benton County kind of led the state in that. And at one time, if you won Benton County, maybe still now, that you typically can win the state and Republican side. So
a lot of this happened before I was here. I'm more just aware of it through just general knowledge and talking to people. In the early 80s, with Reagan's election, particularly is when it started, the Republicans in Benton County really started to become more prominent in contest races. And over time, they got to where they had a lot of the offices. When I came in '92, I think we had 2 JPs that were Democrats. J.C. Beaver was, and I think there was one more JP. 2 of the judge at the time, all the judges in the state were elected on a partisan basis. And Judge McCullum, Sid McCullum, who's passed away recently, he was a Democrat. David Klinger, when I got here and went to work for him, was a Democrat. He switched parties when he ran for judge a few years later, but he was a Democrat when I got here and had been the whole time. But things were slowly turning, and over time it became more and more Republican. The state as a whole tended to hold more Democrat, and it was kind of odd because throughout the South at that time everything was flipping Republican, flipping red. it is my opinion, I don't have any research to back this up, but my conclusion was the reason that Arkansas held on to blue longer is solely because of Bill Clinton, because of the hangover of him being governor, and then the fact that he was president, he was from here and he was a Democrat, and I think that just held on to the blue a lot longer in a lot of Arkansas. Of course, now it's pretty much like the rest of the South. Generally, the rural areas are red, meaning Republican, not that we're on colored teams. And generally, the cities are more Democrat, more blue. Benton County is entirely red. When I was the county chairman of the Republican Party, I can't remember who the last one was to go, but one of the things I remember getting to announce at one of the meetings was that now all of the county offices throughout were Republican, and we could be very proud of that as the party.
What about the impact of Bella Vista in the equation, where you had, you throw in thousands of retired voters maybe that were more so in one area? Does that part of the thing that led it to switch, you think?
The impact of Bella Vista, I would say it's more than just Bella Vista. It's Bella Vista, but also the area around Beaver Lake. And a lot of that is retirees from, used to be retirees. We think of it as being retirees from the North or from Yankee territory. Now I think of it as that plus Californians. And generally those people that move in are older. And they're usually retired. And their politics are a little different because of that. And generally those people who were coming in were on the conservative side of the agenda, if you consider the Republican side conservative. And so we had that, but we also had the homegrown Republicans here. The Barnett family from Siloam Springs, Dwayne Neal, the Hutchinsons, which includes Asa, and Tim and Tim's two sons, and Donna, and the whole group of them. So, and also of course the Hendrons, which the Hendrons and Hutchinsons are connected by marriage too. So,
before we get on to some of the final questions, is there anything else you want to talk about that I haven't asked about specifically, maybe, or?
I really can't think of anything. As I've sat here, things have gone in and out of my mind, but it's, when you're sitting here doing one of these, that's just the way it is.
Let me ask you this. If someone came to you and said, maybe somebody from another part of the country or somewhere else that hadn't really ever been to Benton County, and said, tell me about Benton County, what would you tell them?
So what would I tell people if they were asking me about Benton County? And this answer evolves over time. I actually got this question a lot when I was running for office and I was out visiting with people, because a lot of people, I remember folks in Bella Vista who had no idea what was going on here. I mean, they were living here and they understood generally, but they'd ask me, what's a quorum court? Why do you have a county judge who's not really a judge? Those kind of questions. What I would tell people about Benton County is it is a great place to live. It is not the same place it was when I got here. When I got here, the city of Bentonville was about 10 to 12,000 people. Might have been a little bit more than that. Now we're probably 56, 57 today. It's a different world. Everything's so busy. My office is about a block off the square, and I've been in this office. My partner has owned this building, or owned half of this building, since 1986, and I've owned my half of the building since 1998. And I can remember coming down here on the weekends to work, because I had a trial, or I used to do tax returns, and I'd come down here the 2 weeks before tax season. I'd be here nights, weekends, everything. And I can remember walking out, and I would be the only person in downtown Bentonville. And it was like you see in sometimes when they're talking about old cities, and wasn't quite everything boarded up, but we had empty buildings down here. Well, now you can't come down here any time of day and there not be people down here. On the weekends, well, on Saturday you can't come to downtown Bentonville because they got the farmers market, and it's not a little casual thing like it once was. It's almost like a big business. There's so many people down here. So it's changed. It's crowded. Although, having said that, I just got back from a trip where I drove through Nashville and Knoxville. So crowded is all a relative term. But it is just much different. It's not quiet. It's not, property values have gone through the roof. We have a different kind of people here. Bentonville in particular is trying to do things to increase the density of downtown. And so we have changed our zoning laws such that when they build new things downtown, everything's closer together. And part of it is people are different. You know, I still mow my own yard. I'm about the only person around my neighborhood that does. And when I got here, everybody did. And part of that is just the changing character. I think young people just have a different attitude about those sort of things, and were brought up differently than I was.
One last question. How would you complete this sentence? My favorite thing about Benton County.
How would I complete the sentence with my favorite thing about Benton County? My favorite thing about Benton County are the people. And it is changing, but the people that I have a great affection for are the old timers. I said I grew up in Fort Smith and I went to high school there. My people, so the way they say, my kin, are all from Greene County, which is Paragould. And it's had some growth too, but I kind of think of the people of Benton County as I do the people from that county, my family. I'm related to a bunch of people in Greene County. And they're just good folks. They're good folks out there living their lives and growing their garden and having their potlucks and going to church and working and raising families. And that's the fabulous thing about, I guess, all the people here. I guess people are doing that everywhere, but there's just a comfort level to the way people talk and the way they move through life that I find really to be attractive.